Bizarre things are happening on the world scene these days, and they need to be viewed through the perspective of Scripture. And here to do just that, two of my very best friends, L.A. Marzulli and Richard Shaw. Guys, welcome to Prophecy Watchers.
Thank you,
Thank
Gary.
you. Thank you.
Let's talk about something else that's on Watchers 10, and that is the existence possibly of a real 21st century living giant. And we have about 10 to 12 minutes here to tell a very, very long story. But both of you have a part of this story. Richard, you've got a part of it. L.A., you've got a part of it. Tell us.
Well, we need to give kudos to Stephen Quayle, because Stephen Quayle is the guy that broke the story, and Steve is an incredible researcher, second to none. And he broke the story years ago about a pilot who brought out a very, very large giant, at least 12 feet tall, 1,100 pounds. And the pilot was on George Norrie's show and gave a testimony. And George Norrie comes in, very exclusive one-on-one interview that we did for Watchers 10, and talks about this. And he allowed us to use the actual exchange between George and the pilot.
That was back in December of 2008 when that happened. So, I wasn't thinking that we should do an extension of this for Watchers 10.
This was not even on the radar.
Crossed my mind.
Yeah.
Until I was on a radio show, Dr. J Radio, and he was interviewing me about the Torah code. So I was trying to explain to people on air what's really going on in Israel, because so much of that's covered up. No one really knows the problems people are having on the border with Gaza. I mean, the Hamas and lobbing missiles over and shooting mortars basically into the communities.
Almost a daily occurrence, by the way.
I mean, they have walls of concrete barriers up and this kind of thing to keep them from doing that.
So that you set the story in the Middle East, and then you had a caller.
And then I had a guy that called in and said, I just want to back up what Richard is saying because this is all true, and I've been there. And I said, well, what is it you do? And he said, I'm a contract operator. I've had several tours of duty in Afghanistan, and I'm very well acquainted with the Middle East. And he was rattling off like military technical things. I mean, I knew this guy wasn't making this up. He was talking from experience. So I said, I'd like to talk to you after the show, because I said, this is really interesting. So I get on the phone with him, and he tells me about this giant that they had encountered in Afghanistan. And immediately I remembered back to Steve Quayle's story about this pilot. But I'd never heard about anything before that, So evidently this guy was saying that he was one of the troops that shot and killed the giant.
Well, if this actually happened, every one of those airplanes, you're talking about a C-130, I believe, involved in ferrying this giant to somewhere unknown.
Right. But the actual shooting of the giant happened in a remote location. And then it was airlifted out by helicopter and taken to the Kandahar airport.
Which exposes a lot of people, because there are a lot of people in an air ferry crew on a C-130 or on a helicopter, so a lot of people would have seen this thing.
Oh, yeah.
You got one perspective, L.A. got another perspective, right?
So I called L.A. I said, look, I just talked to this guy that shot the giant that Steve Quayle talked about a few years ago. I said, I think we should talk to this guy, but I want you to talk to him too. So I gave him his phone number and had L.A. call him.
And I called like the next day. And this was one of like 3 or 4 phone calls. And this is what we do, when we just don't have people come on camera. There's like a whole vetting process. And having, like you, we've interviewed hundreds of people just in Watchers, but even before that. The bottom line is I sat this guy down on the phone and we're talking. And every single time he tells me the story, because I would call him up the first time, which was the day after. Then I waited a week and called him again, then met with him face to face twice. And then we brought him out, and then we did the interview. Every single time he got to this one particular part of the story, he would choke up, break down, hang up the phone, weep. I mean, he was, okay, maybe he's a great actor.
But it
was real. That's my point.
I think it was
real. It was genuine.
His best friend was killed by the giant.
Yeah.
Essentially what happened.
And let me give you this. Can I tell you the story?
Sure. I can't wait to hear what the giant looked like.
Well, I'll get to that. The bottom line was there was a patrol that was dispatched in a very rugged, remote area in Afghanistan, 2002, looking for high-value targets. So the patrol is dropped off by helicopter. They do their thing. They're supposed to check in. They don't check in. The second check-in time comes in. It doesn't happen. Third one.
They call them rally points.
Rally points. And they never met any of the rally points. So everybody's going, were they all killed? Was it an ambush, a firefight? What's going on? A second patrol is dispatched, dropped off in exactly the same.
That's where our guy ended up.
Yeah, we'll call him a shooter. He's in the second patrol. The shooter's now in the second patrol, embedded with these guys. And they're following this goat trail. They're coming down in this very rugged area, looking for the lost patrol. And as they're coming down this goat trail, the shooter in front of him, he sees these like white fragment things on the ground, and he realizes it's bone, and also there's like meat attached to the bone.
There were bloody bones on the ground and torn up military equipment,
like the radio
gear that he recognized, but it was in pieces. And so, what's happened here? I mean,
so they're going wild animal. Were they butchered or something by Taliban? I mean, no one knows. So they come down the goat trail, and it ends in like this little plateau, like a ledge. And on the edge of the ledge, it goes down. It's a precipice, like 500, 600, 1,000 feet to the valley floor below. And they're sort of dispersed. Nothing's happening at this point. All of a sudden, out of the cave comes the thing of someone's nightmare. It's 12 feet. It's got a large spear, at least 10 feet tall, in its hand, a shield in the other hand. It's got flaming red hair. Later on, they counted the 6 fingers to this thing, 6 toes, double rows of teeth. And this thing is like ready to fight. These guys are absolutely petrified. Who wouldn't be? Can you imagine something 12 feet tall coming out of the cave, a nightmare that's not supposed to exist? All your training doesn't kick in, nothing. You're just stupefied. You're standing there, shocked.
All of a sudden, there's this really big dude standing in front of you, and actually up above them a bit. He was like on a ledge.
He's on a ledge, so it's even more pronounced.
So he was like looming over them.
Wow.
And he jumped down with this spear, and it was really adept with it. It was really fast. I mean, this is one thing that he told us many times. He said, I didn't expect the speed and agility because he said all of the CGI effects, and he mentioned this, that you see in movies of giants, they're always like kind of lumbering along.
Yeah.
That is not the way it was. This thing moved like quickly.
It had a lance, which, by the way, corroborates a lot of other work you've been doing.
Yes, which we don't have time to get into.
Which we don't have time.
It's a lance. It's like a 3-foot lance on a 10-foot pole, and the giant could swing around with this and bag you with the end of this pole as well. So he knew what he was doing and used to using it. The weird thing about it is, why has he got this ancient Roman shield? Right. I mean, he was using really ancient tools, and he was dressed in a way that was, very ancient.
Very
odd.
Very odd.
It was really strange.
So as the firefight happens, these guys are at the mouth of the cave. A giant comes out, and we could get into the way he sounds, but the part that always leaves me, and this goes back to where the shooter chokes and the shooter breaks down every time he tells the story. So they're dispersed, they're frozen, looking at this thing. One of the guys is named Dan. Dan breaks loose and he starts firing at this thing, at the giant. And this is where the giant moves with such speed and agility that it defies logic. How's this thing moving that fast? Before Dan can do anything, he's impaled. He's hoisted up on this petard, literally, in the air, one hand. And the giant, according to a shooter, isn't done. He's coming after more of them. At this point, the training kicks in with these guys. Someone, and the shooter thinks it might have been him, yells, shoot him in the head, shoot him in the head. And they just blast this guy's face apart.
They had big guns. They had semi-automatic weapons.
308s, 50 cals.
50s, and basically shot the giant in the chest and in the head, in the face, and actually blew the bottom part of the giant's face off,
which killed him.
Where they could look into it. And when the giant was laying on the ground, he told me, he said it was like looking into a cave because his head was so huge.
The eyes were as big as a man's
You
fist.
could see his teeth in there, but it was really kind of a mess after that happened.
Double rows of teeth.
But this was like, a very smelly, weird.
Had never had a shower.
Yeah.
And regularly killed and ate human beings.
He was a cannibal.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that the giant was a cannibal.
And all the locals knew that.
Wow.
The locals knew that he was.
Now, if this is true, and apparently a lot of military operatives have sworn that it's true, and they have the emotion to prove it.
Yeah.
Losing your best
The
friend.
third witness came in on Watchers 10 also.
And then standing at the loading area of a C-130, when this thing had to be weighed and had to be tied down to a pallet, you got a good close look at it. There would be a lot of emotion in that. That would impact me greatly if I were there. I know that.
Yeah.
Well, the pilot, when going back to the original interview
With Steve
on
Quayle.
George Norrie's show, the pilot said that the whole thing, the whole package with the giant, the pallet he was on, and the rigging to hold him down weighed 1,500 pounds. He said so the pallet and the rigging weighed, about 400 pounds. So the giant weighed like 1,100 pounds by itself.
It's a really
And it
good
was
guy.
fast.
And he said it was like 12 feet long and kind of curled up, and that's...
Now, biblically, this kind of makes my mind activate. So I'm going back
Mine too.
to Goliath of Gath, and I'm going back to the Anakim and the Zamzumim and the Zuzim and the Rephaim and all those other giants in the past. There is, you could almost call it a conspiracy to cover that up.
Yes.
The giants were just myth.
Yes.
They were not real. And you've been, as you have said many times, on the trail of the giants for quite a while. And let's leave this story for just a moment and go back to those skulls, because the Nephilim skulls are tied up into the same historical picture, right?
Well, it's all part of the research, and we think there may be a correlation between, believe it or not, the giant of Kandahar and what we see and what we discovered down in Paracas years ago. This was the basis for Watchers 6. Brian Forrester was creating these YouTube videos, and we saw one, and we made a beeline down there with a team of people, and we began to discover that, in our opinion, the Paracas skulls, these greatly elongated skulls, found on the shores of Paracas, Peru, right on this beautiful coastline, there seems to be genetic tampering. And our hypothesis has been that 3,500 years ago, Joshua and Caleb, when they pressed into the promised land, into the Levant, these giant tribes, and you mentioned them, so I won't do it again, were there. And there was a diaspora of giants. And they fled. Some went northward into Europe and over to England and into the New World and settled in the Ohio Valley. And we've talked about that before.
Right.
Work of Fritz Zimmerman certainly echoes that. But others perhaps built boats and sailed down to Paracas. The Paracas people show up about 3,500 years ago from nowhere. There's no pre-existing culture. They have elongated skulls. They have tapestries which are not part of a new world. They may have had the wheel, which originated, of course, in the Middle East. Everything is pointing to whoever these Paracas people were, they were not indigenous.
And all of this flies in the face of the modern humanist myth of humanity having risen from little small ape-like creatures to his present size. In other words, we used to be this tall, now we're this tall. The exact reverse may, in fact,
This is why
have
we've
been
had
true.
so much resistance from the scientific community.
Now, I've got to tell you how to get this this DVD, Watchers 10. I think you may be interested by now, and you're going to see.
Let's hope so.
I think you're going to see so much more than we've had time to talk about today. It's called Watchers 10 Years for 1995. Go to the Prophecy Watchers online bookstore. Click the bookstore, scroll down, you'll find Watchers 10. By the way, you'll also find the entire Watchers series, the entire DVD series 1 through 10. And if you don't have them, you need to have the whole set, sort of bring you up to date. And again, it's all right there on the online bookstore. Watchers 10, 1995. And by the way, with every order, we send you a copy of our magazine, The Prophecy Watcher. And L.A., you have an article in the current Prophecy Watcher.
Proud to say that I do.
And it's an up-close personal story of your ongoing research.
And the big thing in Watchers 10 is that we do DNA testing on 5 elongated skulls from Peru.
And by the way, that would be well covered in this DVD.
Yeah,
absolutely.
L.A. Marzulli, Richard Shaw. Guys, I think the Lord's given you a very special ministry. I pray that doors will open and that you'll get to complete your research.
Thank you, Gary.
What a story. And praise the Lord that the words of the Bible are corroborated not in one way, but in many different ways. Wow, it's an exciting time to be alive. I'm Gary Stearman. We're watching. You keep watching, too. Thanks for joining us on Prophecy Watchers. You can find us on the web at prophecywatchers.com